Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Jenkins, and I'm the Conference Working Party Chair of the 2024 conference. I'm also the outgoing Chair of ALIS UK and Ireland. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to Central St Martin's for our 2024 conference. It's really great to see so many of you here. On behalf of the Conference Working Party, welcome to Artificial Visions, navigating the intersection of art, AI, and libraries. It's great to see you here. I particularly want to extend a very warm welcome to colleagues and delegates who are joining us online. It's really great to be able to, in this day and age, to offer a hybrid event and broadcast beyond the confines of the lecture theatre. So, when we were developing the ideas for this conference, and we were having a chat around where we wanted to go and how this AI is, all pervasive and coming into our lives in ever greater ways. We had a little play with ChatGPT to see what ChatGPT might consider an appropriate title for our conference. And here are some of the examples. You know, it feels quite poetic, some of it. But I felt it was an interesting way that it kind of shows how the algorithm kind of bundles together terms and words. And sometimes, there are all sorts of interesting mixes of what it's considering. But nevertheless, there's been enormous bounds of progress made in the and some of these unnerving truths about the way online content can be packaged and served back to us by AI through user agreements in social media providers. Also, these ecological consequences of these huge servers that run to process all this information. The unnerving pace of change and the AI chatbots, which are employed in ever more roles. I've had a number of encounters with these chatbots when I've wanted to get through to somebody in customer service, which is always quite interesting. What do I have to tell it to speak to a real person? And I don't suspect can I speak to a real person, please? It's almost reminiscent of that Microsoft paperclip. Do you want to write an email? Which is but also I'm struck by the sort of the massive chatterbox that kind of is reworking internet mythology into whatever and whatever else it's presented into and weaving it into statements and stories and narratives, almost similar to an Orwellian versificator, which assembles thoughts, feelings, desires, and into poetry according to an algorithm to ensure banality in a type of newspeak. Once we settled onto the theme of the conference, which was obviously somewhat inspired by what ChatGPT offered us there, But we felt that maybe we needed to do some design, and then we asked an AI art generator to see if it could produce some images for us. And to our delight, it came up with this, which if we ever have an aerial branch of ALIS, I think we're going to winner with one of those designs. The other one has an interesting interpretation of London, and also an interesting interpretation of numbers and the arrangement of letters. But so this will obviously I also want to acknowledge now that it was probably better to get a real person to do this. So I just want to acknowledge Alice Nadler, our designer, who put together this beautiful image that is accompanying the conference material. But, after 3 days, I'm not sure where we're going to end up. But maybe that final image that is certainly something that, it left me quite speechless. And I think at this point, what I'd like to do is, again, welcome you. Feel at home. Please engage with us. Talk to the mix with each other. Take it easy and have a great conference. Now I'm going to ask Joe Baines to come up and introduce our keynote speaker, Juliette Sargeant. Thanks.
So welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote of this conference. And our first keynote is Juliette Sargeant, who is Director of Library and Student Support Services here at University of the Arts London. And she will be kind of setting the scene and talking to us about how UAL and AI are working together.
Thanks, Jo. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me here today. I'd like to begin by thanking ALIS for inviting me. It is a privilege for UAL to be hosting this conference of such an auspicious and really important association. And I'm absolutely privileged to have been asked to do the keynote, so thank you. Preparing for this speech has demanded an awful lot of reflection on my part, which I think speaks to the great moral and ethical importance of this topic. It is appropriate to be speaking here at Central St Martin's, which is a college that's never ever been afraid of embracing new technology. And at UAL more widely, a university with expertise in developing innovation and research in using AI in creative processes, practices and education. My name is Juliette Sargeant, and I'm the Director of Libraries and Student Support Services here at UAL. And I think my title speaks to the immense importance of the libraries here at UAL, because everything we do in student support emanates from this focal point. It was once said, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that a university is a group of buildings gathered around a library. And I'm sure many of you will agree with that. Its role in university life may in fact expand with the growth of AI, which is a thread that will run through my remarks today. Though, as will become evident to you, I say this with a note of caution. In a 1985 lecture, American historian Melvin Kranzberg said, "Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It is, as he goes on to say, a very human activity, infused with human values, both good and bad. Behind every machine," he says, "I see a face, indeed many faces. The engineer, the worker, the businessman or the businesswoman. The function of the technology is its use by human beings." And 30 years on, these words really do speak to us afresh, I think. Technology is not something that is done to us, it is something we use. Whether we use it to pursue moral and ethical aims is our choice. And we should bear this in mind if we are to continue bringing AI to the library experience. Kranzberg also reminds his audience of the importance of technology to history. All history is relevant, he says, but the history of technology is the most relevant of all. And the history of the library is indeed a history of adaptation to new technologies. In the beginning, of course, with the development of technology to write and to record. And as you all know, amongst the earliest libraries is the Library of Ashurbanipal. It was founded in the 7th century BC in the city of Nineveh by the king it's named for. Discovered in the 19th century, it contained as many as 40,000 clay tablets. They detail everyday administrative records, but also include great literary epics, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, a foundational piece of religious writing. H.G. Wells, as you may know, called this library the most precious source of historical material in the world. And then we can look at the Great Library of Alexandria, which was established in the 3rd century BC. In its heyday, it housed as many as 40,000 papyrus rolls. And Ptolemy I, the library's founder, wished to possess no less than every book in the world. But the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a storeroom. It was a great centre of research and made a vast contribution to human learning. And many great scholars lived and worked there, including the mathematician Euclid and the inventor Archimedes. The Library of Alexandria was one of the great triumphs of antiquity. But its destruction at the turn of the first millennium, either by neglect or arson, speaks to the fragility of the knowledge that lay within. We move on to the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, which was arguably the biggest revolution of all in this space. More books were printed in its first 5 decades than in the previous 10,000 years. And of course, the printing press created economies of scale and democratized access to knowledge. Then the 17th and 18th centuries became a golden age of library building, and it was in this period that the idea of a library available to all emerged. In the 19th century, libraries in Britain were increasingly public and free. And then the coming of the internet was a revolution, arguably equal to that of the printing press. Millions of books have been digitised. Google alone has digitised 25 million. The library, once physically constrained, is now as vast as digital space. The function of the library in our era, then, has fundamentally changed. Today, every physical library in Britain also provides access to digital library. And libraries are also community centres and mental health providers. They are training centres for digital skills and language learning centres. My point here is that the library is not a static thing. It is a morphing system that evolves, grows, and adapts. And these aren't my words, but a description from a seminal new piece of research called Looking Towards the Future, which focuses on the potential of AI and other digital transformations in library spaces. Specifically, it looks at whether AI can better the library experience, at how it can improve their overall performance and efficiencies. But if so, how? When we talk about AI, we sometimes think of it or conceive of it as like an alien invasion, Terminator, if you like, which encourages that deterministic attitude that Kranzberg warned about. But AI is not an alien life form, nor is it indeed a unified concept. It is in fact many things. A research paper from 2020 called Intelligent Libraries sets out a really quite helpful taxonomy. There are, as the authors see it, 4 types of AI tools that are particularly relevant to libraries. The first type is what they call expert systems. This is, in effect, when machines are trained to make decisions that people make. And since its inception, this technology has been particularly useful in healthcare, for example, enabling clinicians to make more precise diagnoses and decisions. And it can have a similar function for the library, including cataloguing, classifying, and organising resources. And the second type of relevant AI is natural language processing, or NLP. This technology, in the form of chatbots, has been around actually for decades. But the emergence of programs like ChatGPT have made it particularly exciting. For libraries, these tools can improve search optimization and information accuracy. And the third type of tool, according to this taxonomy, is pattern recognition, where systems are trained to look at unstructured data and then classify it and categorize it. And these types of tools are often used in security systems, but they have 2 relevant applications for libraries here. First, intelligent interfaces to online databases, And second, machine learning in library services, by which I mean acquisition and processing of knowledge and resources. The last type of AI which is of interest to libraries is robotics. And this technology often conjures up images of libraries staffed by sort of legions of androids or robots. But for libraries, the use of this technology can be somewhat more prosaic, with applications in scanning systems and text processing. I'm going to pause for a moment to share with you a video by Professor Rebecca Feebrink. And we're in UAL, so it's really important that we showcase some of the innovation and thinking and research that some of our researchers are doing at present. And Professor Feebrink is a researcher here at UAL's Creative Computing Institute. And she's working in a really interesting area of research around AI and creativity. Rebecca talks about another potential use case for AI in a library, and I think this will interest some of you, specifically relevant to an art library or relevant collections. I've got to try and make this stop.
I'm Rebecca Feebrink. I'm a professor of creative computing here at the UAL Creative Computing Institute. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been doing research that really looks at how machine learning and artificial intelligence can be useful to human creators, people in music, in interactive art, game design, and so on. So for instance, one of my first projects in this field looked at how machine learning can be useful to enable people to build new musical instruments. So if you have a performer on stage and you want to capture aspects of how they're moving, maybe with sensors or with video cameras, and you want to map that to real-time control over sound, machine learning turns out to be a really good way to do that. I'm really happy that everybody's talking about ethics and AI these days. There are the ethical questions that I think are on everybody's minds, especially around really big machine learning models that might be trained on millions, billions of data points, maybe without people's consent if it's being trained on artwork or music, and there are big ethical and legal questions around that. And then of course there's also ethical questions about the environmental impact of these models, about the fact that these models maybe are used, they're built by a fairly small number of companies with a lot of computing power, and those companies don't necessarily have the interests of creators in mind. So I think all of these absolutely are ethical issues that we should be paying attention to. They're important. At the same time, in a lot of my research, I look at alternative ways of doing machine learning that sidestep or even really directly push against some of those ethical problems. So for instance, in a lot of my work, I work with very small data sets that an individual creator might generate from scratch, maybe examples of how they want a musical model to make sound, using examples of their own music or using examples of their own artwork or their own movement. And this is really powerful, not only because that person has total say over where those examples come from and they probably have ownership of them, but also this allows people really a high degree of control and agency in shaping what those machine learning models do. So I have a really exciting project right now, which is led by Professor Susan Puisenlock from the Decolonizing Art Institute. And that project is called Transforming Collections. I'm working on a piece of it with a number of CCI colleagues where we're exploring how machine learning can be of value to people working in cultural heritage institutions, especially archivists, curators, art historians, and so on. And in that project, we're really looking at, how can machine learning help people to understand and engage with their collections in new ways. So for instance, looking at all the object descriptions in a collection and saying, hey, we know there's maybe biased language in here, there's problematic content in here, these were written by people many years ago. How do we find content that maybe we want to update? Now, people have, especially in the last few years, been doing things like a keyword search to say, hey, here's an outdated term, let's find this and we'll replace it, which is great, but that's the tip of the iceberg, right? You really need more sophisticated approaches if you're going to be able to do things like say, hey, find me examples of language that describes really problematic colonial relationships between people, or find me examples of object descriptions that use art jargon and aren't really accessible to the general public. So machine learning can give people a way to say, hey, here's what I'm looking for. Here's some examples of what I'm looking for. Try to find me some more stuff like this in a collection. And I'm really excited about this. Again, I think there's interesting ethical questions here around the use of AI, but a lot of what we're emphasizing in this project is that AI use in heritage institutions, in collections, it doesn't need to be these general purpose off-the-shelf models, which might be trained on data that's really biased, on data that maybe isn't super applicable to a collection, but instead looking at, how can we use AI to help people working with collections express the ideas for the things that they're interested in, the things that they're looking for. And one of the most exciting outcomes so far is that when people start building models to express ideas about information that they're looking for, that they want to model in their own collections, it's not about improving efficiency, it's not about necessarily big data working at scale. Often the exciting bit is that people start thinking differently about their collections, they start discovering new things about their data, and they start questioning in really productive ways their own assumptions about what they think is important and what they're looking for.
And I will share a link to that really fascinating project, Transforming Collections, with Kathy. You can circulate it following today. I hope you found that useful. I mean, it's one of the examples of the really exciting research that's happening within UAL about the interface of AI and creativity. And I really thought it was important to sort of showcase something while we're here. So Rebecca's talked about some of the AI programs that might be relevant to the library and collections experience, but if we wish to implement them, how might they be implemented? And what risks could we associate with that implementation? So before I come on to how we're considering some of those practical considerations, I'd like to first talk you through some of UAL's principles for using AI, which were drafted by colleagues in our teaching and learning exchange, academics within colleges, and academic support. Our position then is guided by 5. First, we will encourage AI literacy among our staff and students. It sounds very simple, but it's about encouraging, not warning against. Second, we will equip staff to support students' use of AI. That interface with staff supporting, enabling, facilitating is absolutely critical here. Thirdly, we will adapt teaching and assessment practices where appropriate. And fourthly, we will ensure academic rigour and integrity is upheld. And finally, we will work with other stakeholders to share best practice. And I hope that today is an example of how we are sharing best practice within this sector as well. And in addition to these principles, we set out a vision statement for AI here at UAL. That is, that we will embrace it through a curious, critical, and compassionate lens. Curious, because we will do so through play, experimentation, and exploration. And in doing so, broaden our perspectives, contributing creative solutions to the complex problems that AI presents. And critical, because it is only through debate and reflection that we will contextualise learning and embody UAL's principles around climate change and social and racial justice. And finally, compassionate, as we support students' use of these technologies in their learning and prepare them for a world of work in which AI will be commonplace. So these are the principles then, but how might they actually work in practice? The first area I wanted to talk about is the student experience, and here we feel AI will have 2 really important applications. First, around inquiry management and chatbots, and we've already heard references to chatbots this morning. At UAL, we are really proud of our library services. Our customer service excellent. Just need to mention our CSE accreditation review yesterday, where we got 10 compliance pluses. And our support for students. We're really so proud of that. And so to supplement our online inquiry system, we developed a chatbot that is active out of hours. And really importantly, we are explicit about the fact that students are going to be speaking to a bot, which helps them manage their expectations. And one of the 5 options a bot presents to students is something else. And they're then presented with an Ask Inquiry ticket, which is then answered by a member of staff when they're next available. The chatbot is not then in any way designed to replace our members of staff, but instead designed to complement the service, the excellent service that they already provide. At UAL, however, we do believe that overall our online inquiry system could be better. And in 2023, we ran a hackathon with students from our Creative Computing Institute. And it explored how we might use AI to improve that student inquiry process. The work led to an improvement in the rate of responses by the chatbot, although the model did experience data hallucinations, including making up the names of courses. The project also presented another hurdle to the adaptation of these technologies, and that is, and as we've already made reference to, that AI programs are incredibly energy intensive. And UAL, like many other institutions and organisations, has a mission to become a carbon neutral university by 2030. So if we are to introduce these systems, we must ensure that they also meet our commitments. But nevertheless, this kind of experimentation is vital. Not only did the project show us some of the benefits of AI chatbots, it gave us a greater appreciation of the risks, including the potential for a lack of human contact at the initial inquiry stage. And these concerns will have to be addressed if we are to go forward in an overall inquiry change transformation. The second area of student experience AI can help with is, of course, discovery. The UAL archives, collections and special collections is something of which we are extremely proud. We have archives and special collections dedicated to filmmakers, designers, makers and painters, including the archive, of course, of director Stanley Kubrick. Spanning his entire career, it includes photographs, scripts and research materials. And of course, many of our other collections consist of physical objects as well. Paintings, costumes, designs, programmes. An immense amount of work has gone into this already to digitise it. And we've also catalogued hidden collections. We've taken ownership of institutional orphan collections found in a cupboard or under a staircase. We've added metadata and we've updated our subject terms. But the sheer volume of content presents us with significant new challenges. And as I mentioned earlier, digital libraries are as vast as digital space. How then does a student navigate such a vast quantity of information? There's a story with which I'm sure you're familiar by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges about such a predicament, and he called it the Library of Babel. It imagines a library as vast as a universe. The books, each 425 pages long, contain every single possible combination of words, meaning every book ever written or that could be written is shelved in that library. Most of these books are, of course, completely meaningless gibberish, which is a nightmare for the inhabitants of this universe, who spend their entire lives trying to decode and navigate the library's endless volumes. Thankfully, UAL's collections of digital library are not quite so incomprehensible, but it is nevertheless essential that we make the contents discoverable. And like each of you in your own institutions, I'm sure, we've invested a lot in this enterprise. But the reality is that still so many of our collections are stored in siloed systems, with discovery dependent on users knowing how and where to search. AI has huge potential here. We're really proud here at UAL of our Articles Plus Discovery platform, which blends traditional library contents with e-content. And we're proud too to have developed our digital collections platform that puts our students at the centre of their own curation experience and breaks down some of the barriers to access that people have historically faced. The platform allows us to draw from disparate systems, unifying the library with archives, museums and research outputs. We know, though, that there is still a really long way to go to create a unified discovery experience. And in the near future, AI may well help us design a product-neutral approach to discovery, in which we help students stumble across things in our archive. It's a more organic experience, more akin to picking up a random book in a library or the book next to that book in the library. What would or could such a system look like? It might suggest or bring materials to the surface from outside our organisation. It could make distinctions based on attributes, experiences or interests. We want to challenge ourselves to create such a system, although this of course brings us to the threshold of really deeper ethical questions. Is it possible, is it fundamentally possible to create, to curate a truly serendipitous library experience? Will an AI-powered system reduce a student's appetite to go deeper into our collections or our archive. Sometimes the search for the book is as important as the book itself. And an article, even a line chanced upon, can spark a new idea. The risk is that we turn students into passive consumers of content, as if they were shoppers recommended a new item on Amazon, not intrepid researchers delving into the depths of our collections. And this is something we'll be reflecting on at UAL as we improve discovery. Which brings me to the next area I'd like to talk about, which is skills development, by which I mean helping students become more critical users of AI tools. And the first part of this is data and algorithm literacy. This really builds on the digital literacy skills that libraries have been providing for years. But it's time libraries offered algorithmic literacy training too. Some of you may be familiar with Jonathan Haidt's book, The Great Rewiring. He argues that since 2010, mental health disorders among young people have spiraled. In the US, mental health issues that once afflicted between 5 and 10% of adolescents have now grown to afflict around twice that number. Haidt believes that ubiquitous smartphone use among young people is the culprit. Whatever our views on Haidt's research, it certainly speaks to something true, that the way that young people receive and consume information has fundamentally changed. Young people ought to be aware, they need to be aware, that their receipt of that information is not neutral. It is powered by algorithms fine-tuned by social media companies, rich with bias. AI is making these algorithms even more powerful. So what would algorithm literacy look like then? The Algorithm and Data Literacy Project lists 4 things that students might learn. That AI is not magic, that algorithms are not always right, that the data that we use to train algorithms matters, and that AI comes with ethical issues like bias. But this training would not dwell on the negatives. It would help students become more creative in the use of this technology, and this is especially relevant for students at universities like UAL, focusing on creative practice and inquiry. In Canada, Digital 2030 and UNESCO launched the Algorithm Literacy and Data Project. It raises awareness, educates young people about how algorithms affect them, really conscious of that generation alpha and how we need to help them and nurture them through their understanding of the receipt and consumption of information. Its purpose fundamentally is to help young people become more critical thinkers in that space. And there's lots we might learn from this project. At UAL, we already have some AI guidance in place, developed and delivered by our library services colleagues, which helps our students understand issues such as copyright, and includes information on studying, teaching, and researching with AI. The second part of skills development I wanted to reference here is translation services, or machine learning in language. UAL is home to students from 130 different countries, and a huge proportion of them speak English as a second language. Increasingly, we are seeing machine translation tools used at the university. These tools can provide instant translation of lectures and conversations, used in studio, in lecture theatres, in social contexts. But libraries and universities in general, I would suggest, should be cautious about their use. We want the exploration of our university collections, inquiry, creative practice and experimentation to provoke debate amongst students, for them to work collaboratively on projects. And if we're not careful, this collaborative spirit, those collaborative skills may be lost in translation, if you'll pardon the pun. Where there is risk, however, though, there is also opportunity. Such tools can give English-speaking students access to books and texts in different languages, and to teach to value multilingual contexts and multilingual cultures, with the potential to actually increase collaboration between researchers of all nationalities and backgrounds. So I hope my remarks have given you a clearer idea of UAL's position and principles. I began by talking about how the library is something that has evolved over time and how it's changed to adapt to new technologies. AI presents libraries with the next possible step in this evolution, and that change is fraught with risk. But we at UAL are exploring how we can go from a position of principle to practice, from fear to embracing, and we look forward to working with you all as we do so. Before I conclude, I'd like to return to the words of the historian Melvin Kranzberg, specifically an anecdote he recounts. It's about the lady who came up to a great violinist after a concert and said, "Maestro, your violin makes such beautiful music." The violinist held his instrument up to his ear and said, "I don't hear any music coming out of it." The violin was, of course, no use without the virtuoso player. But then again, without the instrument, the violinist would not be able to make the music. AI is a tool and should only ever be used to improve and enhance the library experience. And I will be reflecting on this in the coming months and years. Thanks very much.
So, we thought that as part of the conference it would be a really good idea to have a panel discussion between people who are working in their practice and can talk from their experience of thinking about AI in a practical and critical way. So we found 4 excellent speakers for you today. First of all, we have Rowan Williamson, and Rowan is currently Associate Director of UAL Library Services. Associate Director of UAL Library Services, and you lead teams across 8 libraries in London. And as a senior teaching fellow, she has a specific interest in embedding critical information skills into the curriculum. And you're also chair of the Digital Technology Group too. That's Rowan. We have Robin, who is a London-based artist and technologist, and you're based at Goldsmiths, that's right, isn't it? And you're also a product designer, set designer, and 3D artist. Erin Ma, at the end there. Erin Ma is Walscourt Associate Professor in Immersive Media at UWE Bristol, UE, I think it's normally known as, isn't it? In the School of Arts at UE Bristol. And they are invested in experimenting with subcultures of technology and scientific practice to relearn how to live equitably within planetary limits. And you're a member of the Digital Cultures Research Centre, and also working with a project called Alt Tech Just Transition, funded by NERC. I'm sure you'll hear lots more about those projects. Our last speaker is Pauline van Lorik-Broekman, who is a lecturer in critical media practice at UCL's Digital Media MA in Production. And Pauline is an artist, writer and editor who co-founded Mute magazine, which I'm sure many of you as art librarians will be aware of, a forum for the critical discussion of technology, art and politics. And I can say more, but I will not say a lot more, I'm sure. So the idea of the panel is for each speaker on the panel is going to spend a few minutes talking about their own practice and the issues that have arisen in their own practice and their thinking about AI and explaining their work and how AI has intersected with their work and practice. And then we're going to have a discussion between all the panellists about some of the issues that have been raised in the talks. And then we're very much hoping that we'll have a dialogue then with delegates, between the panel and delegates. So I really hope that you're going to have some questions that you want to discuss with the panellists. So looking forward to having that dialogue. So I'll let you start. So thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Kathy. I'll start us off, if that's okay. So I'm Rowan from UAL, and obviously Juliette has already given us quite a good idea of kind of what UAL's been working on. I'm going to talk just briefly about what we've been thinking about, specifically in libraries. A couple of questions there about kind of practically how do we do some of these things around information literacy and algorithmic literacy. So I'll talk a bit about that. We have spent the last, I guess, 18 months pretty much watching and listening. We've been experimenting a bit, we've been encouraging staff to experiment, we've been trying to look at what UAL's doing, what's happening in the general landscape in AI, and thinking about how, as a library service, we position ourselves in the conversations at UAL in a way where we can demonstrate our value, really, in this area. And that's been particularly of interest around the conversations around academic integrity, so UAL developing those principles, for example. And we've kind of been having a lot of conversations about information literacy and a more explicit shift towards critical information literacy as an approach to tackle the ethical implications that we feel are coming with AI, which again Juliette's touched on. So particularly around challenging ideas of authority, particularly around aligning with the UAL's social purpose agenda. And so I've got kind of 5 areas where we're thinking as a library service we can position ourselves, really. And one of those is that area of access. Juliette referenced about the financial constraints for students, and that's obviously for a library service really important that we recognise that actually we're already in this space where open access, creating access to resources in a fair way, that everybody can access those, that the philosophy is there, the principle is there. Digital inequality in all forms is of a concern, and so I think there is something really important there about the library. The paid for and free models of and how that changes student experience with AI is something that we need to consider. And I know that there's an example, I think at Manchester Met, where they've actually, part of their AI guidance or policy is that they've explicitly stated to students, you know, this is the tool that you should use, and it's a free tool, so therefore it's about trying to promote that idea that everybody should be using the same thing, and not creating an inequality there. The other one is accessibility, and Juliette touched on the fact that we've got really high levels of international students. I think we're over 61% of our students are international. So the English is not their first language in most cases. And our language colleagues have developed an interesting kind of approach to this, thinking about AI as a spectrum. So again, moving us away from kind of really binary, this is a good resource, that is a bad resource, this is okay, this is not okay. This kind of developing spectrum of what's okay in terms of language tools. And that's really about recognising that rather than focusing on these tools giving an unfair advantage, which is a conversation we've heard earlier on a lot, to the fact that they could potentially level the playing field in terms of our student experience in many ways. So yes, there's ethical implications, yes, there might be unfairness, but there's a lot of opportunities. The critical information literacy is something we're exploring in library services, and again, it's about us recognising that sometimes we fall into the trap of teaching in a very binary way, and that concept of authority is important here. Whose voice is heard in our research, in the resources that we have in our collections, is a really important question for us as librarians. And in terms of AI, whose voice is being surfaced is a really tricky one, as we know, for information literacy. So that critical thinking that's in information literacy already needs to now take on a really nuanced approach, I think. AI can flood, proliferate, amplify certain voices, and at speed with text generation, and it can be hard to source where that's coming from. But it also has the ability to enhance and amplify voices that perhaps till now have been harder to hear and have not surfaced. It can tailor specific styles and audiences. There's a reach there that might not have been there before. And I want to flag that, again, as Juliette said, libraries are not neutral and AI is not neutral. And as we curate and perhaps then recognise bias in our collections, apply a decolonisation lens to kind of correct course, to tackle those biases, to tackle changes in the world and our information as it's reflected, that's something that AI also will experience. You know, it can be full of bias. It will be something that we need to interrogate, that algorithmic literacy is going to be important to doing that. Our management of data and information in itself is going to be important to doing that. And we may have to course correct and reset. In the field of academic integrity and art particularly, obviously we're going way beyond many people talking about text generation, but we're talking about image generation and all those things as well. So bringing together in our conversation something which in this institution has traditionally been quite separate, which is the copyright conversations and the intellectual property conversations. Those two become a lot more blurred and integrated now, I feel. And then the final one is, again, something that Juliette touched on, and that is that I think that libraries very much at the moment are talking about humanity and empathy. We're talking about compassionate librarianship, compassionate pedagogies. Those are things that we've used, terminology we use a lot at UAL and that I hear in the library world. And somebody quoted to me, I can't remember who the quote's attributed to, so I'm going to have to look this up, terrible librarianing. Someday students will not only be able to read the words Aristotle wrote, but ask him a question and get an answer. And yeah, that's moving us on, isn't it? From reading those words, processing and coming up with your answer, that's a different thing. But that is a very transactional knowledge, presentation of knowledge. It's not a compassionate interaction, and that's what we do well. And I still feel like AI has a really long way to go in terms of its humanity. So I think there is a role for us still there, and that's incredibly important. I've talked loads, I'm going to leave it there and pass on to Pauline. No?
Hello. Yeah, I have some nice slides. This is going to be interesting. Next slide, please. So, my name is Robin Leverton, and I'm an artist and technologist. Last year I completed an MFA in computational arts at Goldsmiths University of London, and for the past 18 months AI has been the focus of my practice and investigating into its materiality, its methodologies, and the assumptions that are embedded within it and that often leave no space for disagreement or dissent in how they are imposed on us within our daily lives. So I began 18 months ago, as in the same timeline that Rowan's just mentioned, when suddenly AI became everything, right? And the internet was flooded with an endless supply of photorealistic, surreal imagery. But immediately I felt that was completely uninteresting. I don't need a creative agent to engage with how the photoreal space is, as like in creating commercialized images that are sanitized for production and take the space of people's labor, which is all it's doing if you're trying to reproduce something that is essentially a photograph. And so I wanted to investigate what's the weirdness within this machine, and I brought with me this analogy of the octopus as something that is unfamiliar and alien, like totally separate, and yet we're able to empathetically understand the kinds of decisions that they make. And so, next slide, please. That empathy is something that I think is forgotten and lost when we interact with AI systems. So if you scroll down one, because like I think we need to evaluate what our relationship with a system like state diffusion or any other AI that is generative, because we are bringing a lot to the equation here. To a computer, white noise is just as valuable as a photo of your loved one. The reason why the photo of your loved one has any meaning or any understanding is because you're bringing cognizance of imagery to the page. There is nothing inherent within it. And so within this very mathematical understanding of what an image can be, the AI model is trying to copy the way in which we're bringing that meaning to it. So a transformer model such as stable diffusion is matching how we have attributed labeled images to the words that we want to produce or use to generate them. It's essentially trying to co-opt that empathetic pathway that you have with something that you visually see. And this produces a hyperdimensional vector space, a mathematical geometry within which any possible image is located as a position in space. And so I wanted to interrupt this and ask what is the first thing that this model would see if I pass in my face and then ask it this question of portrait of the artist as a young AI. By doing this, it's the earliest conception that the model outputs this like blurry image here, and then I brought that into my own print practice, creating it out as a block print, and then asking that of the audience to do the work of the AI now, so that you're having to conceive of what the image to be produced is from the prompt. So next slide, please. And so with this anthropomorphizing of these machines that I think goes on, I was reading a lot of Norbert Wiener and cybernetics, and especially about feedback, and that got me thinking about a split between the sensory and the analytical aspects of the way in which we approach the world. And I created this animation which has two main characters. One is a small Wall-E-like robot powered by algae that is a collection of homogeneous sensory organs. So it can move around this space and it can interact with the world, but it's not particularly able to understand it. It can't process the information, it can't analyze it. And this is partnered by the giant computer, which is fungi, which is a heterogeneous singular multitude. It can process and disagree with itself. It can understand the world, but it can't sense it. It's not able to embody itself and interact. And so the miscommunications that occur between these two agents is where difference is made and where like creativity, I think, kind of lies. And this is also where I started to see AI as a Gothic material. So I think we're all actually familiar with this in the marketing and hype. So Sam Altman has told us he is making a machine that will kill us all and end humanity, but we should give him $7 trillion to do it. You know, this material is something that we're producing in our own image in the hope that it transcends us. It's the horrific that we desire. And so next slide, please. So this kind of Gothic nature of what I kind of perceive AI to be as a material, I then wanted to reflect with this depressed AI octopus, which is a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine, connecting all of those thoughts I had about like this AI theory of mind. So cameras taking object detecting, so this is like that intuition, moving that onto stable diffusion, that is like the mind's eye, which then is understood by an image recognition system, which passes it to a large language model, which acts as a conscious layer, which then goes through sentimental analysis, which finally outputs some colors represented on the octopus's skin. And so this is an artifact that is attempting to be an organism, but then by showing all of the material at work, this console is running what's going through the mind the whole time. My computer is there within the space. It's showing itself to be both material and a fiction, that everything of it is constructed, and it is constructed in front of you. On to the next slide, please. And this is where I think, where I am at the moment. AI is a very material process, and it is a set of fictions. It is material in that to label data, to produce a data set, to make something that is in some way a model or a reflection of the world requires thousands and thousands of labor hours. And this is usually done by people in the global south. Additionally, it is intense amounts of CO2 emissions. There's so much energy that is required to run the servers, that is required to train these models. And then data centers take up massive footprints, often in areas which are water deprived, because those are the areas that are cheapest to put a giant building there, and then stealing all of the water from the local resource to cool these data centers. Then secondly, as a fiction, all of these labels, all of the way in which this data is analyzed by human workers are categorizations that are passed down by the capital that is paying for this data set. And so these are assumptions that are being put onto data by the hegemon that is collected and now wants to extract from it. And in so doing, these are not going to be exhausted. There are going to be edge cases, there are going to be points at which conflict appears between labels or categorizations, that it is not up to the laborer to make that decision. And so these things get forced, and then beyond that, the whole idea of compressing something into a model is a compression of the real world. It is not the reality presented, it is a fiction inbuilt into it. And this is dangerous when these things become agential, when they start to interact with the world. And that's what this piece is about. So this work is called Missing Persons, and it's looking at the ethics of the use of the Habsora system, or the gospel, which was implemented by the IDF to pick bombing targets in Gaza. Prior to the use of this system, approximately 50 targets would be chosen per year when done by human workers. After the use of this system, about 100 targets per day. And then the update to the system, Lavender, which was used in the weeks following the October 7th attack, identified 37,000 targets. And so when you consider the data set that this would have been produced from, if you're getting 50 per year, that's not going to be a large data set over a number of years. And then scaling that up to 100 per day, any issues, any assumptions, biases, missing data, incorrect outcomes are going to be magnified, on a terrible scale. And they will be magnified because AI systems are patrogenic. They are pattern reproduction machines, and so the inbuilt assumptions within their data sets are what they will reproduce upon the world if they are being used to involve themselves in the world. But to conclude, bias is inherent in any collection, in a data set, in an archive, in a library, but that's not a negative. It's just a matter of situatedness. And it is important to understand and acknowledge those situatedness and use that when critically analyzing the outputs of something that's made by a generative model, so that you don't take it as the gospel. Thank you.
Have you got my slides? There's a PDF version. Alright. I'm going to talk about things that overlap with the prior two speakers, but really trying to use my practice or the projects that I've done that aren't so much in the field of AI, but are definitely in the field of digital culture, to encourage kind of like the idea that actually all of us have a lot of knowledge, about how we should be seeing AI, and that to really counter the kind of AI hype that was just described, we need to think about the history of digital culture a bit differently, so that certain sort of maybe key moments are better enshrined in our minds as sort of turning points at which the way we now engage with AI became possible. So I'll go back to the projects I was involved with, but really more just as an example of a particular thing that someone did from the mid-90s onwards that is probably quite similar to things or workplaces that you've been involved in. Okay. So in the mid-90s, early 90s, the discourse that we now see sort of hyped around AI was then obviously the hype around email, the internet, the World Wide Web. I was a recently graduated fine artist and was very interested in the way in which this kind of advent of a new way of accessing information would circumvent certain gatekeeping mechanisms in fine art or in visual art. There seemed to be really obvious parallels to the way that DIY spaces could be created in towns, which was then happening very much in London and in Europe. So Mute, the magazine that I co-founded with a Slade graduate, I actually went to St Martin's, made a kind of playful intervention into this this phenomenon that said it was really new, but actually we could instantly see not only replicated certain prior historical moments, as Juliette mentioned, the printing press, but also had a relationship to power and capital particularly that was belied by some of the rhetoric that surrounded it. So at the time it was very much like the internet is going to give people a voice. And even through something like our title, Mute, we wanted to question this sort of automatic assumption. So there's all along been a kind of problematization of the idea of democratization, the idea that new technologies, open networks, give everybody a voice. And we also wanted to do that in a slightly more nuanced way than just what immediately became a language of like the digital divide or digital access. We wanted to say, there is a vocabulary out in the world with which we can think about this. And one of the vocabularies that we were interested in was the actual vehicle of the publication itself. So the magazine that we made used prior art strategies, which were basically ones of appropriation, to present itself in all these different formats. Like the first one that we used was the Financial Times to indicate through the body of the magazine, how much the internet revolution was suffused with capital. Could you do the next slide? Mute published from the mid-90s onwards till about in a kind of semi-funded and ultimately regularly funded way by the Arts Council till about 2014. So the archive or the web archive that's now on the internet is sort of dormant. And as that happened, which people might remember, there was sort of like the post financial crisis moment in arts funding where there was a massive restructuring and recomposition of the cultural landscape. So Mute's ending was sort of forced by the fact that we were one of the regularly funded organisations that got completely cut. And in that moment, what happened was that you could really see that because so many people got cut, the historical memory was also, a victim. There were archives considered marginal that were being jettisoned from university collections, from libraries themselves also often were defunded. And at that point, I and a larger group of people started talking about what could combat that kind of tendency. And I was involved in co-founding an organization called Mayday Rooms, which tries to sort of go against that trend of historical loss and to make specifically a kind of physical space in which people can engage with archives and historical material, particularly around radical movements, in a way that makes, as we called it, history a weapon. So rather than archives being an object that you passively look at, you actually encourage handling, you encourage integration of the historical ideas into your own political struggles. Yeah, could you do the next slide? So that was around 2011 that we started talking about it, and the space opened in 2014. It's still very active. If you want to ever go there, there's a lot of amazing collections. I stopped working there in about 2016, partly because I started this PhD, which is about the sort of questions of what authorship might be in a networked moving image environment, where I tried to use the legacy of a Soviet filmmaker called Ziga Vertov, who's the most famous film man with a movie camera you might have heard of, and really started to kind of analyze what is the platform economy for an individual artist. If we think about how Soviet culture, had this kind of state apparatus for collective filmmaking, and we now in capitalist culture have single devices that collapse, tons and tons of computing and technological power into one device, but that also allows us to engage in collective movements in some way. So that PhD was extremely long and ended up engaging a lot with poetry. But these three projects, I suppose, allow me to look back on the evolution of digital culture in a way that I think posed some questions. So I should probably accelerate a bit. Sorry if you do the next slide. Yeah, so particularly during the PhD, but also building on the work of Mute and Mayday, I was interested in these kind of seminal texts that I suppose a lot of you will have come across. It's the idea that as society becomes more financialized, more datafied, more algorithmized, what you see being produced is not only bias, but a sort of automation of biased procedures, such that people fall through the net, injustice becomes automated, and the kind of classification mechanisms that computing grants starts to perform these really inhuman actions, what you also described. So these are some key texts. Could you do the next one? When we then move into the discussion of AI proper, so that's where, because only 2 years ago people weren't talking about AI, they were talking about big data, and effectively we need to think about those two discourses as pretty much the same. What people started to talk about in the analysis of AI, or at least the critical analysis that I'm interested in, was the way that AI, particularly Dan McQuillan, who wrote Resisting AI, and also David Columbia, you have to think about AI inside the social context that it evolved within. If we had a totally egalitarian society where people, where there wasn't a hierarchy of labor, where certain people weren't marginalized to work for nothing, we might have a completely different AI. But the fact is, the AI that we have grew up in hyper-capitalism, white supremacy, etc., and therefore the AI literacy that we needs to understand this intersection between the environment and the process of AI. And these are some of the books that I think make these points, and also about extractivism. and the kind of right-wing, what McQuillan calls fascisization, that you can see as a sort of tendency within the procedures of AI. What they also show, again repeating what went before, is that they're not moving towards intelligence. We need to deconstruct them as probability pattern-based processes that present something back to us that looks like meaning or looks like intelligence, but is actually this kind of chance probability-based automated device using material that's being fed into it from a variety of realms. And I'm going to get to the point that I want to make. Sorry about all the detail, but hopefully this gives you, some of the sort of key tropes from these critiques, also around labour conditions, which repeats what you said. And here, just to give you a detail from an incredibly perceptive and I think really very brilliant analyst, the editor of a journal called Critical AI called Lauren Goodlad. So she did a great lecture where she, again, tries to make this kind of separation between how we think of AI, i.e. in anthropomorphic terms, and how we should actually think of it, i.e. this statistical modelling. Again, here we see what AI is really its kind of life world, which is the legacy of these sort of discourses and belief systems that really are from the very early heyday of sort of libertarian computer culture that even Mute in '92 was responding to in its response to magazines like Wired and Mondo 2000 and all of that, which is the sort of desire to go beyond the limits of the body, the desire to download the brain into the matrix, the kind of, if you think about how all the sort of, tech bros grew up with Neil Stephenson, William Gibson, the kind of imaginary that actually comes from that phase of science fiction is really kind of embodied in these ideologies that come packaged with AI. So we say, right, we understand that there's racist, misogynist bias, there are these hallucinations that are even peddled by, the most senior spokespersons of the big five, the big six, the platform companies, to instill a kind of panic or to instill a kind of version of ethics that actually dissimulate what the real issues are, which are around labour and the conditions in which the data is gathered. Sorry, I have gone on too long. So, this is the examples of hallucinations and just skip this one. What this timeline tries to show is, as I argued before, these kind of key moments where the kind of data scraping that we now see became possible. But I'll end it on there. Sorry.
If you've got my slides in Google, you can share a link and pop it in the chat for the people online so they can have a chance to look at them.
We can share the screen. I don't think the chat is quite working as it should be at the moment.
Yes, I'll try and be brief.
We'll share some delegates after as well. So.
All right, well, the option's there. I'll be brief because we're meant to have a conversation. I think that maybe I missed the message that we weren't giving a lecture. My name's Ruma, and I was going to give you some insights around some work that I've been involved in. But let's start with the story, so let's go to the next slide. I think it's really important in these times to think about what it is that we bring into our lives and into our homes, into our communities, into our environments. So for me, this book is really powerful. Bell Hooks is all about love. And so you might say a simple algorithm might be to consider that we know compassion, that love redeems, that fear stands in the way of knowing love, choosing love against lovelessness. So that's my algorithm that I bring into the room today. And on the topic of love, if I were to think about my favourite art libraries, I would think to Whitechapel Art Gallery. I would think to the Stuart Hall Library Foundation. Whitechapel Library, why that art library? I've never actually been into it, but I know that there's possibly a painting in there that I've never seen in real life. And it's one of David Hockney's 3 love paintings. And my mum, I was brought up in the East End of London, my mum had brought us up, 4 kids, single mother, and she took us out to go to art galleries. And we were too young to remember these paintings, but she went to David Hockney's show, I think it was 1971. And then years later, she told us this story and how she'd seen these love paintings. And all she told me about them was that they had the feeling of love and friendship in the colour red in one of the paintings. So I've kept that notion of red with me, and I've never seen the painting. I don't know if I found that painting yet, and there's 3 of them. So I've got the desire to go to that library and find David Hockney's love paintings, but I haven't plucked up the courage to talk to, I need to talk to a person to help me to find that painting and everything about that exhibition from 1971. So I'm really interested in values, beliefs, emotions, and I think that's one of the things that we have to bring back into the conversation. We've heard about the history of AI and the systems around it, but that also speaks to the cultures that exist that create these tools and these technologies. So I think there's something really important about libraries that we can consider. So next slide, please. Stuart Hall Library Foundation, why am I interested in that one? Because I was invited as part of a collective, Squirrel Nation, project that I did with Caroline Ward, my partner and artist, researcher and designer. We won, I think, the second opportunity to be artists in residence in that library. And that was the first time, actually, when a librarian had taught me through how to use the library. And it was just a wonderful experience. That this is how it works, remember, this is how you can search for things. What are you interested in? And then we went to the computer, we sat down, they'd put out some books that they thought we'd be interested in, and that was the beginning of a relationship with that library. And it started with that librarian who said, do you know how it works? And I said no, and I felt like I could say no. So I think, we can think about technology also as ideas and dreams and practices, procedures, hopes and myths. There's a great podcast series by Ursula M. Franklin, which you can check out, and it's turned into a book called The Real World of Technology. Next slide, please. But what I also read in the Stuart Hall Library archives, and Stuart Hall's grandfather's cultural studies, very interested in artists, and also thinking about the history. How do we get to this moment? How do we get to a moment in which we are moving towards right-wing fascism across Europe, in the UK? We've got our election coming up on Thursday. We've got wars going on all around the world. How do we get to that moment? And so when I'm teaching to my students and they want to use AI, they're going to understand about the history of AI, and that came out of the 10 white men, maybe more, imagining and thinking about AI solving problems, and then the American government picking up on that and saying, oh, this is intelligence, surveillance. Okay, so we have to think about these moments. So my students are going to have a history of colonialism when we're going to talk about AI and their use of it. I want to ignite them to think, and they're looking at me thinking, oh God, please no. And it's like, no, we're going to go through this because it's a history that's really important. It's not present in our universities. I'm going to teach it to you, you can delve into it yourselves. So this is really important for Ramon Amaro, who is really interested in this idea that this idea of data that the West has placed its massive confidence in. I'm a biologist by background, and I escaped biology and its sins into the art world, thank God, but art world has its sins as well. But it loses its efficacy when faced with the very own notion of a life outside of its own obsession with social administration. What happens when we get outside of that notion of a life that's obsessed with social administration and the data that we might be collecting on our students, on ourselves? And actually, think about it as a disabled life. Apologies to people online, I haven't described myself. Brown skin, grey hair now, got an orange strapped watch on, and I've got a walking stick because I'm newly disabled. And the thing is, in becoming disabled, I've learned from so many disabled people who've come before me, and that is, the world's not built for us. It absolutely isn't, black people, the world's not built for us. So our biggest tool of resistance is our creativity and our imagination that we use every day to navigate the horrors that have not been built for us. And so that's what we have to foster in our students. Next slide, please. So Patterns in Practice is a project that I work on currently with an amazing bunch of people. You'll see the slide at the end that acknowledges them all. But there were some themes that came out of us looking at 3 case studies. We worked with higher education and how teachers were working with their students, thinking about contexts in which machine learning and data mining was happening. We did qualitative interviews with, I say we, but actually it's and Monica, who you see on the screen, did the interviews. We looked at case studying chem informatics and how chemists and their managers were working with machine learning and AI and data mining to get at the culture, the values, the emotions behind what AI is evoking in those different contexts. And then I led on an arts case study with Monica. And these are some of the themes that came out: feeding the machine, call for collaboration and meaningful work, tactics of resistance, very much led really from the arts case study, where it's thinking about how do I not do harm, how do I think about the environmental impact of using machine learning, how do I not scrape all the data off the internet and actually use personal data sets for me as an artist to then do something interesting and different. And again, that's a kind of idea of collaboration. Deficit of surprise, so the chemists were telling us, we're doing all this machine learning, it's not telling us anything that we don't know already. Is that interesting? But maybe that's the point in which you can spring from and think, well, what else is out there? And then where the magic happens, this sprung out of a dialogue between practitioners across sectoral conversation, and where the magic happens. It's a really hard one to describe, we still haven't quite got our fingers on it, but it's that idea that when your personal values and social justice align in your work, whether it's working with machine learning or something else, there's the possibility for magic to happen. And I think that art brings that to us. And so let's hold on to that possibility of art creating possibilities for futures that have not yet been imagined. Final slide. So I was part of this racial justice fellowship, a cohort of amazing people. So Caroline Ward, Sarah Chanda, Yasmin Budiaf, and Irene Fubaram Emmanuel, and then facilitated by Louise Hickman. And these scholars are incredible. It's really important that you look them up, because we have the founding fathers of Dartmouth and AI, but seriously, these people are the founding fathers of how to think differently about AI and what's really kind of underpinning it. We came up with a community agreement, and I'll just end on that. So our community agreement, we were meant to share our work with people who funded us, and that was a very extractive environment. So we had to create a way in which we, as black, queer, disabled scholars, could think around that. So we invited people that joined our online labs, and this was facilitated by Louise Hickman, to participate with an open heart, a curious mind, and a spirit of generosity and solidarity. We requested that we collectively commit to these tenets in practice, and one was access as practice, and this is an ongoing, it's ever-changing. You always have to kind of think and reflect, how do we do on access? Process, not outcome. Informal and not performative, so we're not going into workplaces necessarily, we're here in an artistic and creative space. We didn't want that professionalism coming into our space. And then to acknowledge that structural oppression and racial injustice is fact in the same way that we recognise that climate change is fact. And that accountability is not punishment. So if we're going to call you out for some of the things that you might do because you haven't been educated in the ways that we might have in terms of racial injustice, it's not a punishment, but accountability is important. So let's reflect on it. But also then to think that we are respected and credited for our work. And this, I think, really speaks to thinking about AI authorship and the tensions that come with the democratisation of these technologies. Yes, it opens up a space that people have the opportunity to do interesting things, to make new art. What does that do for those artists whose work has been used? And people like FKA Twigs have made really interesting points around that. So I'll leave it there. I don't think we have much time for discussion, but yeah, that's what we are. If we could just go to the last slide, just so you can see the amazing people, the whole list of them, amazing people that I've worked with. We had an artist residency at Watershed, so check out Watershed, the amazing work they do, artists in residence and so on. And then Joe Bates is our principal investigator on the Patent and Practice project. And there's a great podcast that you can listen to.
I don't think we do have much time for discussion, but I wonder if anyone here has got questions for anyone on the panel. Or do we have any on the panel or online? No.
Maybe there are some things.
We do.
We have a question.
Right.
Sorry, I'm going to make this one.
Yeah,
I work at, by the way, thank you so much, everyone was speaking about was so interesting. I work at an arts university and yeah, I feel the bind of having to go down this road of AI without having a great deal of opportunity for dissent within that. And I wondered if everyone does feel that the best thing we can do is provide context and inform students. Is that the best we can do? Anyone who wants to sort of tackle that is, I'd be happy to hear from.
I missed the first word. Contest.
Contextualising it for the students.
I think it's important that we do, but I think it isn't. I don't think we should just accept it, which is why I'm saying, we go further than saying information literacy, algorithmic literacy, know this, know that, critically evaluate. I think it speaks to actually what you're talking about, which is we need to be more explicit about where that, not just where the data comes from, but how we build cultures, how we recognise value in our society, in our communities. So I think those conversations with students about, the nuts and bolts of critical analysis, critical evaluation of sources need to go further, need to go all the way into that. Those ideas about neutrality, challenging assumptions, challenging where and what we value and who values it and whose voice we're hearing in those sources themselves. So yeah, as someone who works in an organisation that has an AI set of principles which are very much permissive in terms of AI, I do see my job as being to actually go along with it to a degree and say, yes, we need to educate students. But I would say that critical lens and what more we can bring to it in a more radical way is really important.
I think there's also an aspect of this which touches on what Erin was saying about accountability is not punishment. I think there's, pardon me for the joke, but another way to verbalize AI is accountability insurance. It's a way to give over to a system a set of decisions that you can distance yourself from and say, well, the computer said so. And I think part of that criticality is again to parrot what Irma said about bringing an emotional response, an emotive response into the way in which you're using AI. It cannot be there is no such thing as a neutral standpoint of enacting a technology like this, and it requires an understanding of both what it is as a material and also the what those outcomes relate to the work that you would otherwise be producing. You know, if it's neatening up a bit of text that you've written and put a lot of effort into, that is a different activity from producing an image and having that as the cover image for your paper.
I mean, I would go back to bell hooks again. So, you know, what's my role as an educator? Her book, Teaching to Transgress. That's what I'm trying to teach in the classroom, and that means that I'm trying to inculcate values in people that might build community, go beyond who you are, meet someone where they are, find that common ground. That's what I'm trying to achieve through the work, whether it's making a piece of AI artwork or it's, you know, them writing an essay. And I want them to come with those choices, you know, to arrive at those choices. You know, these intercultural tensions that we might have between international and home students. You know, it's a big thing to get to university, and so this is what I'm looking for, to inculcate community building, cultural choices, going outside of your comfort zones. You know, having the conversations about religion and identity and queerness, and bringing that into the classroom. You're going to get that from me. You're not going to get that from the AI. And so I think for me that's what is important. We have a set of AI principles at UE. Of course we do. I think every university in the country is going to have that. But what's really important is going to be the discussion with the students, because they're using it. And as soon as we ask that question, you know, then they're using it. So let's bring it to the surface, and then what does that allow us to then go on to teach about politics, the state of the world, the futures that we want. For me, that's the exciting opportunity. But I do see the challenges that librarians will face in facing this. But I think there's a good long history around, you know, bell hooks again. She archived her own work. Why does she do that as a black academic? Because she has to. Yes. Why does Stuart Hall Library Foundation exist? Because we don't have these things. And so for me, it's like looking to the margins, and how do you teach those kinds of skills of archiving, and what does it mean to archive Stuart Hall Library and to go in and explore it? For me, that's what's interesting, that we can kind of bring those conversations into play for our students, which then allows them to think, oh, how do I look beyond the usual canon, the Western canon that's being presented to me? So just bringing that back in, really.
Yeah, I suppose, like, going back to this idea of the environment, it's a bit like with, for example, the essay writing, you know, where we're now having to detect, like, to what degree it may be used or may not. I think there's also a way in which you can think about, well, why are students even wanting to use it? You know, if you had teaching practices that really responded to the individuals in the group in that way that really recognises who they are, then there might be less interest in actually using AI. So it's that constant flipping of, like, okay, if you have a system that's obsessed with certification, you know, or just-in-time production everywhere, then of course AI is attractive. If you built this more communitarian method, you know, where you say everybody in this space is bringing knowledge that's valuable, then maybe it becomes less attractive. So, yeah.
Just one thing to finish off. I just got to bring back to the story of my mum and the Hockney paintings, because it's a brilliant story. So my mum was looking at these Hockney paintings, and we're kids, you know, listening to this story, and we're not looking at Hockney paintings, and she tells us that the paintings were £48 or something like that. And she looked in her purse and she thought, do I buy this? It's £48. new artist, really interesting. And she looked in her purse. If she bought it, we wouldn't have eaten that week. We wouldn't have eaten the next week or the next week. So my mum didn't buy that painting. Those paintings are worth millions of pounds right now. And we are there, like looking at her. Oh my God! And she said, I wouldn't change that choice. I wouldn't change that choice. And she carries around this experience of having seen this amazing painting. And then when one evening when I was celebrating with friends, and I felt this feeling of that red, and it was a feeling of being with friends, of communing. And so for me, it's like, that's my lesson. She's not gone down the commercial choice of this is going to be worth so much in the future. She's gone with that experience of it. So it's what we bring to it, I think.
I think we probably have to finish there because otherwise people won't get a break before the next session. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you for bringing to our conference the thinking and the ideas that you have. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time for discussion, but we were slightly late starting because of the tech issues. But personally, I found it really, really fascinating, really interesting, looking at the wider context, really, of what we're talking about here at the conference. So thank you, all of you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Davey, Dean here. What we're going to be talking about today is a 2-year research project. I'm going to be kind of framing the whole thing, and then about halfway through, too far. I can hold it. You want me to hold it? Good. This thing is holding a microphone. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about the sort of framing of the project and the aims of the project, and then Dean's going to come in and talk about the sort of focus he has within it, and then I'll come back to me to sort of talk about where we're at now. In terms of moving forward. So I am an artist. I'm very interested in images, the relationship between images and the imagination, and how history is conveyed and confused through images. And most recently my work's actually been about art schools, including this art school. So it's very different to the stuff I'll be talking about today, but I think it's kind of relevant in terms of my own fascination with the shifting, mutating ways in which we see, read and understand images, particularly through AI now. And this work, maybe an important thing to say is that I absolutely do not come from any kind of, even particularly digital imaging, I don't come from a subject knowledge base of AI at all. It was through this research, and particularly through the green logo, is a place called the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image, which is based at London South Bank University. It's really, really brilliant centre, and they're totally invested in this sort of critical analysis and engagement with the status of images now. And so it's through learning of their work and getting involved with some of the stuff they were doing that I've been kind of brought into the project, and then more recently Dean's kind of got on board. So let's start. So yes, one person who's at the centre of the study of the networked image is someone called Jeff Cox. And Jeff has been doing some work for a long time, I guess starting from this book. And I imagine it's a book that quite a few people in the audience know. Ways of Seeing by John Berger. 1972, I think the book came out of the TV show, which is an unusual way round of things to happen. Usually it's the other way around. And so John Berger's work, as you probably know, a lot of you, is very invested in a kind of critical analysis of the ideologies and the kind of hidden labour of visual culture. So within the TV show and the book, he was looking at advertising, media, imagery, but also very much art history from a Marxist perspective. And there's this kind of quote that recurs throughout the research project that seems still very useful today, and that's that the relationship between what we see and what we know will never be settled. And actually that's not a direct quote. That might be incorrect, so don't quote me on that, but it's something very much along those lines. But that sort of seems really for this project, the beginnings of it was thinking, well, what does this mean for now? As our ways of seeing images are being so radically transformed through machine vision and AI. And I guess where I come in is that I'm really invested in education. I run an MA course in art education at UCL. I'm kind of fascinated by education and the strangeness of education. And I work with lots of teachers and lecturers and early years educators and artists, sort of thinking about relationships between art and education. And it seemed really important to kind of try and start to grapple with these questions about AI with people that are teaching. So what role do art and design teachers have in supporting students' critical understanding of and creative engagement with machine vision? And this sort of relationship between the critical understanding and creative engagement is very, very important in all of this work. So this is not about following the sort of dystopian critiques of fear-mongering to do with AI, but at the same time it is about maintaining a kind of critical awareness of the hidden labour, the ideologies, the sort of power, and often corporate power that lies behind a lot of this technology. But also to very much think about kind of creative engagement, playful interventions, and the importance of this starting to happen at school, even before art school. So whilst a lot of you, I think, are located in universities, this research at the moment has been really focused on the school teacher. So another sort of aspect of this is really to acknowledge that I think a lot of work on AI has been kind of, in terms of education, has been happening for decades within computer science programs or by sort of in mathematics education. But actually there's a widespread recognition of the important stake that designers, artists have in thinking about this and understanding this. So this also relates very much to, I think, ongoing, persistent arguments, debates and tensions within art education. I'm very interested in the kind of history of media education. In the UK, there was a moment in the late 70s and early 1980s where media studies, or the study of kind of technology and photography and film and TV, was really having an impact in schools, state schools across the country. And it's interesting, that's been really kind of quite eradicated. There's been a lot of sort of questioning through the, I guess you could say, the sort of post-Michael Gove era that was still within schooling, of the relevance of, say, critical kind of media education. But I think also this sort of relationship between media education and the art classroom, there are a lot of tensions. So what we have here on the left is a journal that was established by actually the person who wrote this book here, which came out a couple of years ago. Andrew Dudney is one of the people who runs the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image. But he also co-founded Schooling and Culture, and that was very much a journal made by teachers for teachers to encourage sort of anti-racist, anti-sexist, kind of critical approaches to education in schools in the late 70s and early 80s. They also made this book, which is an amazing book. It's, I often say it's available for 2p on Amazon. It probably isn't anymore, but it was until recently. There's tons of them on Amazon. It's really great. It's about this sort of history of photography education in particular. And there's a lovely kind of quote in there where they describe the difficulty they had in art schools and how much they developed a real critique of art school education, and that drove them to think about other places to teach art and how art was being taught. And they felt that very often, both within schools and art schools at that time, there was a very kind of woolly notion of creativity that dominated. And actually their interest in technology was about, and photography, a kind of desire to disrupt that or intervene with that and change the terms of an art education. So I want to come back to that at the end. So there are sort of two parts to the project. If you think of it over 2 years, The first year we were funded by myself, Jeff Cox, and Nicholas Malev, who's an artist now based at Aarhus University, and Yasmin Boudiaf, who I think is partly located at CSM, Ada Lovelace Fellow, and various other things. The first year we worked with PGCE trainee teachers. So if anyone doesn't know, PGCE is the certificate you take if you want to become a school teacher. And we really wanted to work with school teachers or trainee school teachers because it's a very kind of precious moment whereby it's very often graduates come out of art and design schools full of ideas, full of kind of critiques of schooling, and they undertake their PGCE and they have these placements in 2 different schools, and there's this enormous sort of moment of possibility. Now for some people that gets somewhat crushed when we get into our jobs in colleges and schools and stuff like that afterwards, where it becomes a battle to maintain the kind of ideas that you have at that formative moment. But we thought it was really important to work with trainee teachers to get them on board and to hopefully follow them through as they get jobs in schools and try and support them to think about stuff like AI, critical creative engagement and stuff like that. So this is the sort of structure of the first year of the project, and the image is just from the initial workshop at the Photographers Gallery. So we had a small group of mentor art and design teachers. They're the teachers who support the trainee teachers. Did a workshop with a big group of PGC trainee teachers, and then we had a public event, and it led to the production of what we called a toolkit, an online toolkit. At the first workshop, we did a number of activities that this one grew out of Nicholas Malev's PhD research, and it was an activity called Seeing at a Glance, where Nicholas's work is very much looking at data annotation and the kind of speed with which, or the effects of the speed with which data annotators, that human labour that is the very kind of foundation of a lot of AI, how machines read images. So he sets up these sort of collective embodied situations with groups of students. So we all sat in a group, and he would show us an image at 10,000th of a second, which is an image that you just cannot really see with the human eye. And then he'd open up this debate as to what did we see, and then he would annotate what the group saw. Now, of course, all sorts of misreadings come out of this, all sorts of ambiguities, all sorts of interesting things in terms of what do we see and what do we not see. So instantly it raises this sort of collective space of debate in terms of the nature of seeing, and it gives the students a sort of very physical sense of how AI works rather than just an intellectual one. That's followed by, we did another one which was more looking at algorithmic bias and image recognition, and we sent them on a walk outside to try and make images that perhaps AI could not read. So we asked them to make ambiguous images that would sort of try and trick the machine, if you like, and came back and had discussions about, again, what would AI see, what would it not see. So both of those were kind of ways in. They worked well. I think the workshops went pretty well. We did lots of things like using the collaborative notepad, which was a bit of a first, within the sessions. And this led to what the whole project had promised, which was this kind of co-designed online toolkit, which took the form of a wiki. And that's available online, there'll be a link at the end. And it collates the activities, some history, some links and resources for teachers to use. So it's all kind of fine, the project was wrapped up, but I felt personally actually quite dissatisfied with it because it was very short. It was sort of 8 months with very occasional meetings, just a few workshops. And I didn't really feel that the teachers had co-designed this at all. This had really been designed by and put together by the researchers in the university. So I was very conscious of a kind of power imbalance perhaps between the school teachers and the people embedded in the university. So that seems to be an opportunity to think about what would we do if we had more money. So I applied for some more money and we got I got, I think, £3,000 or something, to then move forward and kind of really slow down. So here's a few of the thoughts I had afterwards. So one of the problems was, I think what we were doing ignored the importance of sort of tactile, material experiences of the art and design classroom. It really raised sort of tensions through the discussions with certain orthodoxies within art and design education that we didn't have time to investigate or grapple with. I felt that the anxieties driven by TV, radio and stuff about AI were really driving the conversations, and again we didn't have time to kind of get beyond that initial anxious sort of discussion about AI. And then for me personally was this problem of this so-called co-design, which I thought was actually a bit superficial and not genuinely taking time to understand the sort of material conditions that teachers within a very time-pressed classroom environment are under in terms of really making something that could be used in a classroom space. So, yeah, felt that we need to slow down, understand and work with the lived conditions of teachers in the post-Gove classroom. And this is kind of where Dean comes in. So we're thinking about the importance of moving towards the kind of material experience and practices of a classroom. And by the way, all this applies to an art school environment as well, or many other kind of, materials-based teaching and learning environments. So Dean had kind of recently had a show at Standpoint Gallery, and Dean works with robotics, sculpture, diagrams, drawing, animation, all sorts of things. But there was particularly a number of images that Dean's made in recent years that really struck me as incredibly kind of generative images, a way of producing images with sort of diagramming that opens up a space of thinking. So when I look at this image, it opens up this kind of way of thinking about what our senses, the relationship between the social, the physical, the economic, the affective. So the idea was to use some of this money to commission Dean to work with us to produce a poster for a classroom environment. But for that to be done in a meaningful way, Dean needs to get involved in the workshops and working with the teachers. So I think I'll just hand over now and then come back to you after.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Okay, yeah, so as Annie was saying, I got involved at this particular stage of this ongoing project, particularly through my sort of diagramming practice. So I do a lot of diagramming in my teaching and in my art, and I differentiate it from infographics, data visualization. I call it exploratory diagramming. So it's more like diagramming is a way of sort of investigating or exploring something that you're not necessarily an expert and it's sort of more sensory and gestural and less sort of quantitative. So this was going to be my approach to the thing. I was told it was really a sort of commission, which I'm not really used to, but I was told to. So there's a lot of pressure. I had to do a poster that was going into schools. So I guess my main interest really in the generative AI stuff is the learning aspect, machine learning. I prefer the term machine learning than AI for some of the reasons that were spoken about earlier. The term intelligence is problematic, let's say. But there is learning going on. Now, the nature of that learning is sort of interesting to me, and it does have parallels in how we learn from very sort of early infancy. But this project for me was really a sort of research project. Someone who doesn't code, I don't do coding, I don't understand, I can't write equations for multi-dimensional vectors or anything like that. So I'm sort of using analogies and sort of images to sort of think through this thing. But I did do a hell of a lot of reading and watching YouTube videos and podcasts and stuff like that. And as far as I know, this is the first This image is from a paper which was the first talk about artificial neurons. And it comes from neurologists or a couple of people involved in brain science. So we talk a lot about neural nets, but it actually comes out of studies of brains. And this couple of people who, British academics who later became involved in sort of the cybernetic groups of the 50s and 60s. And they were using this idea of how neurons basically have to wire together to fire together. And it's not like if you wire a little bit, you'll get a little bit of firing and so on. It's more like we either will or won't fire. So it sort of works in that binary way. So it could potentially work with computers that were fairly basic at this stage. But they saw the potential of this, whereby the activity of one node is governed by the prior activity of other nodes. So you couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen. So this was all just a completely speculative model that they put forward. Didn't really get carried out till at least a decade and a half later. I like these images as well. This is from something from Marvin Minsky, who is one of those, I guess, sort of father figures of AI. I mean, he sort of backed symbolic AI in the end, but he has these nice sort of images of the difference between a symbolic AI, where everything is sort of a priori categorized. So we'll type in an image and we'll get the appropriate picture because it's already there, right? And this more sort of analogical or connectionist model, which is more generative, where something is generated through this sort of recursive process of learning, and this process where something depends on what's immediately triggered before it. So he calls that the difference between the symbolic apple and the connectionist apple. It's the difference between a sort of linear logic and a sort of fuzzy logic. I mean, people used to talk about fuzzy logic a lot. I don't hear people talk about that now, but it's all coming out of the same sort of space. And obviously this is a very interdisciplinary thing. Now I'm just showing this because it is a typical diagram, and we see this neural net diagram everywhere, and all the books, a lot of the books that were shown in previous slides today, all have something like this neural net model, which does, it does go some way to explaining it, but I'm rather sort of allergic to this image. And this sort of way of visualizing what is actually going on, because it sort of doesn't explain anything in a way, and is sort of dull, I think. But anyway, this is a good way in to sort of understanding what's happening. Here you don't have a sort of database of labeled images, you have an image, and in the learning process, the model sort of makes a guess at what this thing is. Is it a dog, bird, or cat? It's then through this sort of process of feedback, sort of reinforcement learning. It's given a certain mark, or how well it's done, and depending on how near it is to the right answer, these neuronal weights, these neurons will adjust themselves. In other words, the connections will be slightly different. So the hidden layers are, sort of mind-boggling in complexity. They talk about them in terms of dimensions, but that's a sort of simple visual representation of what's going on. Now I start, okay, this is another one that we see that this is sort of how the model is recognising certain features, starting off with sort of basic features like the edges of things. That's what it detects first. It then moves on to certain features, certain objects, contexts or environments, and then sort of more sophisticated things like feelings or styles. And that's when it sort of gets interesting. So it's not just, these things are not just labeling images now, but they can sort of reverse the process. So you now put in a word, a prompt, and it can actually generate an image. And it's basically the same process in reverse. It just feels a lot more sort of magical. Okay, so then these are the sort of sketches. I did loads of sort of sketches like this. And I think the moment the penny dropped for me was, and it just seems really obvious now, but I was quite ignorant about this stuff. It's just when I realised that actually what the AI model is doing is just figuring out the pattern of all these different pixels. So an image to it is just a certain arrangement of pixels, and a pixel to it is just a certain string of numbers. Ultimately, that's convertible into sort of zeros and ones, and that would be about the colour essentially. And even a very simple image might have like more than 1 million possible colours. So we're talking about, you know, great quantities and a very sort of low resolution image even. So it's then forming the patterns, it's figuring out what the pattern is, because that's what computers can do. And there's a hell of a lot of data for it to sort of feed on now. So this is and the other thing is there's the digital world, everything in the digital world comes from our world. It's all created by people with all our sort of biases and foibles and particularities and power interests and so on. But this was a sort of idea of an image. I was quite interested in the language and the metaphors that I used. So we talk about feeding on data, we talk about scraping data, we talk about adjusting the weights. Like, all this to me seems quite physical, and that's also the way I can sort of intuitively grasp this stuff, because I'm not a mathematician. I sort of grasp it through sort of these physical analogies. But even if you're a mathematician, you're still using this language. So I imagined this sort of monster sort of playing up on that, playing up on those sort of myths and fears that are propagated by the media and the tech companies themselves. Imagining a sort of monster feeding on all these sort of images, labelled images, and going through these stages where it eventually is able to generate an image that we recognise as the thing that the label, that the prompt that we've put in is attached to. So we start off with noise, we move to colours, edges, texture, shape, etc., through turning these knobs. And this creature, this sort of AI creature, sort of grows a brain, which is what they talk about in terms of the sort of multi-dimensional vector space. There's a sort of brain growing. That's the training process. So this was a sort of early version of what I was thinking of. There's millions of images labelled Pikachu. It goes through them all, it goes through this process, it adjusts its knobs, and some sort of virtual brain starts growing, which you can then draw on when it's actually in operation and when we're actually using these things. Now, at this stage, I did like Annie said. Am I going over time? How long have I been speaking for?
I think so. I think probably about another half an
Okay,
hour.
cool. So yeah, as Annie said, I sort of wanted. I do sort of diagramming workshops, and this was sort of an important process to actually sort of myself to get some feedback and to see how these things work with other people. I did this workshop called The Sleep of Reason, using this image from Goya that some people might know. I like this image because I like the title, because it has a sort of ambiguity or ambivalence, whether it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, but is it the lack of reason? Is it when reason's asleep and the lack of reason that's producing the monsters, generating monsters? Or is it reason itself, sort of technical reason that's produced in a sort of fever dream, these nightmares. Anyway, the point here is that I didn't want a workshop where people would just turn up, put in a prompt and say like, hey, this is really cool or whatever. I wanted to get people to actually think about what's happening, like how this, I'm using this very simple free software called Crayon, so it's not a sophisticated one, so they're quite sort of shonky sort of images in a way, which I quite like, but try to generate this image. And again, a bit like the AI learning process, we also learn through a sort of iterative process. So people try to generate this, they're putting in the objects, like the names of the animals and the figure at the desk and so on, but this is not really doing it. You're not going to get anything approaching this unless you put in the word etching and unless you put in the word Goya. As soon as you put those in, then we get something that seems interesting, and even though it's a really weird image and it doesn't really look like the Goya, it sort of looks a bit nightmarish, a bit Goya-esque. It's got that sort of character, or that sort of feel to it. Okay, so this is an image of part 2. So that was the first part. So people had sort of figured out something about what you need to do. So the right prompts, it's all about doing the right prompts. I mean, there's lots of jobs in that area, so it's useful practically, if nothing else. The second part is then to like do something completely off screen and to think through, so I call this inside the black box of text to image AI. Think about how do people think these AI, these sort of machine learning, generative AI systems actually work? How do they actually learn? How do they actually work? Now, the important thing is we start with a bit of a discussion. We use some analogies of how other simpler technology would produce an image, how a person might produce an image from. So we're thinking through all these things, and I'm also asking them to bear in mind the technology, but also to bear in mind the human social factors. And there's no right answer, okay? You don't need to know. I don't know, really. I don't know if anyone knows. Apparently nobody really knows what's happening inside. The point is, it's not the right answer. It's about how you can sort of think about these things through a process of diagramming. And there's some really great images.
I think what's really important you can see in this one is just that again, collective experience of lots of different people. You know, some of them were very kind of fairly abstract or illustrative, some were really sort of technical, some were really trying to think through the correct way, but when you get this range of different approaches, it opens up this possibility for just talking about it. So it kind of led to quite good discussion as well. Yeah. Also, these are on whiteboards. These are on these little portable whiteboards, which are a really nice sort of thing to use.
They're like iPads.
Yeah.
I think, and it's all about sort of handing over agency to people, because we're often with technology, we feel disempowered, you know, and we're made to feel disempowered, and we're made to think that, you know, these things have control over us, they're coming to take our jobs, they're much cleverer than us, all that business. So yeah, it's about sort of handing agency back and creativity. Okay, and then I eventually did this poster, which I'll talk through a little bit before finishing. So yeah, there was an octopus earlier, so there's a sort of octopus theme going on. Now, why is that? I think it's not only because the octopus was a sort of monster and is now sort of super intelligent alien or something, but also to do with the distributed nature of its brain and the fact that it's all about sort of touch and tactility. That's how it seems. So there are two worlds. There's a world of sense of meaning, which we inhabit, and the person doing the desk work inhabits, and the person doing the prompt inhabits, and all the databases are coming from this world. And then there's this other world, which I call the world of computation, because it's quantitative. And that world of computation in this generative AI is split into two parts. There's the learning process. I mean, when I first came to this, I sort of thought it was all happening in real time, which is crazy now to think about that. But there's this learning process, and then it's ready, and then it sort of goes out, and then it's able to generate text. So I'll just quickly go through a few of this. So I used a sort of like horror comic sort of thing, really going with that analogy. So here it's sort of picking up all the images of bats. It doesn't know what a bat is, but it figures out common pattern, which is really this collection of this pattern of pixels. To such an extent, I was then able to know statistically what a bat is. It then goes on to look at, these are all elements of the Goya image. It then goes on to figure out what other things are, what an owl is, what an etching is, what a Goya is. So the brain is growing, the pixels of the neurons are connecting. Is then able to function, to generate things, and to generate things that do not exist, like have not existed before, by sort of taking these patterns that is now learned and sort of mashing them together, synthesizing them according to the stream of text that you enter it, and that's how the magic happens. And that's the finished poster, which is available for schools or for anyone. Anyone can take one. And I'm going to hand over back to Annie now.
Yes, going to sort of finish up. So maybe just one last thing to say about the poster. Again, Dean said earlier, I'm not interested in making a kind of infographic explainer. And, there's something about, I think, thinking about your own educational experiences in school, university, nursery, sometimes it's having something kind of strange on the wall, something that just gets you thinking about stuff and therefore activates you. So we're very keen, partly in working with Dean, but just this doesn't try to explain AI away, but actually opens up this sort of space of thinking. So just recognise we're about to finish. As that was being developed, amongst the little group of teachers, there's about 5 teachers at this stage, sort of on board, working through the project. One of them had the idea that rather than it just be a poster, we were going to put some activities on the back of the poster. She suggested, what about having a QR code on there that links to the activities somewhere else? And that's where we started working with a web designer and lecturer at London South Bank University, Tim Franzen, who ran a session with us, with the teachers, to train us to use this web platform, MMM, which is a kind of web design platform, but it's really, he describes it as sort of like digital paper. It's really incredibly easy to use. It's kind of like the platform I've been dreaming of since the 1990s in a way. You can just sort of drag things across, put in clips and stuff like that. So we've made this website, and so far it's got 5 activities on it. They're not quite perfect. The whole project's very iterative, and we welcome more people to get involved, and I've got a link at the end, so maybe you'll get involved. But the point that this was very sort of decentralised, it gave us sort of autonomy to develop the activities according to the interests of the teachers, and also becomes this thing that they can then teach their students. So again, thinking about this is a vehicle for art and design teachers to be working with web design in the classroom potentially. There's 5 activities on there. And then we had a sort of launch for the poster at the Photographers Gallery, where one of the activities was called Make Like a Machine. And I slightly regret we didn't have time, but doing it here. It's a clay-based activity whereby people in pairs think of an object. This was developed by Jane Stevenson, a teacher in Walthamstow School. Think of an object. They describe the object using what many art and design teachers would often know as the formal elements of art, so line, tone, texture and stuff like that, but without describing, like with the Goya activity, without saying it's a Goya, without saying it's a phone, but to describe it visually, almost like they're an alien or they are a machine. So they make this description, pass it on to somebody else who then has to model it in clay, and instantly everyone's kind of talking and sort of enjoying themselves because they've got clay. The whole kind of fear factor of AI kind of disappears because it's a really engaging activity. And they swap over and we look at the descriptions, we look at the biases that inform our human interpretations of and uses of language, and we look at the sort of ambiguities and patterns that come out in that process. And it sort of leads to a conversation about text, image, prompts, and that sort of thing. So it kind of works really well. So at the moment we're still working on these activities to try and make them fairly sort of universally usable by different people in different sort of teaching and learning contexts. So, and finally, where we are now, you know, always need more time, always need more money, so we're sort of trying to get bits of funding so we can continue working with the teachers. In November we'll do another PGC workshop with the training teachers and try and just continue to build the web space and maybe, yeah, get it a bit more populated. Again, this question of co-design with teachers is still sort of looming, and how to do that in a sort of meaningful way. Yeah, this is very personal, but my position between working with teachers and working with the researchers and artists is sort of complex in terms of, like, in a sense I felt like quite a project manager, which has been sort of liaising between these different groups, but again these things just sort of take a bit of often time and space, or sometimes money. And then finally, again, this question of that I've become really interested in is the tensions with certain practices in art and design classrooms, and kind of tendencies I think in some ways have intensified in UK schools over the last 14 years, since certain subject, well, since schools have become very much about it only exists if you can measure it, kind of logic of schooling. And so art and design teachers have been totally delegitimised, they've been sort of really undermined in terms of their expertise, their subjectivity as thinking beings. And so within all that, I think that's reaffirmed a kind of quite liberal humanist model of arts education, which was precisely what that lot in the late 1970s were sort of really critiquing, and media education grew out of as a critique of that. So it's just interesting to think how all of this has sort of come round in a sense, or persists as a problem for us to sort of work with and through. And I think that's pretty much, yeah, I was going to go on to say a few, yeah, we're looking for money, this talk of what would it be to rewrite Burge's ways of seeing, what would it be to remake it? I think rather, yeah, we've got a couple of links here. Please take away poster. It has the QR code to the website. But easier might be, yes, that last slide, maybe it came in later. Well, there is a QR code, maybe we can email it to you. But it's just a form for if anybody wants to stay in touch and get involved. Or just hear more, get updated about the research, please get in touch. And I think, yeah, so we can email that to the, possibly, yeah, I think that's fine. So, thank you.